Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ashish Pradhan, and it's my real pleasure and a privilege to be talking to you and being able to present to you via this medium some of the research that has been done uh, using Sahaja Yoga meditation techniques on the human brain. Uh, Essentially, what we will be doing is to take a look at some of the studies that have been done, and after which we shall have a short meditation session, uh, which is, I presume, the usual standard that Alan does for these kinds of sessions. So let's get started. What we have in front of us is my laptop with some slides on it which highlight the presentation, and we shall walk through those slides, and hopefully it will be relatively clear as to what it is that we are trying to talk about. So what we have are two studies that were performed using the Sahaja Yoga meditation technique, but before we get there, a personal introduction. So as I said, I'm a medical doctor. I work in the global pharmaceutical industry, and particularly in the world of neurosciences. I wish there was a funky way of trying to show my photo, my picture or my image to you so that you know who you're talking to. I'm going to try this once. If it works, it works. Otherwise, I'm going to let it go. And guess what? It did work. So, hi everybody. That's me, and that's probably the only time you might have to see my visage. So let's get back to what we have really assembled for. Alright, so here we go. Before we get started, what I would like to do is to have a brief overview of what the agenda actually looks like. So what we'll do is we'll look at differences between the gray and white matter of the brain, and look at brain volume loss and its implications. Then we'll take a look at the two imaging studies, and we shall take it from there. It's important to get a little bit of background between the gray and white matter differences of the brain, as well as brain volume loss, in order to be able to put these studies into context. I have no idea how many of you have a background in medicine or biology or neuroimaging, so we will assume that that most of us probably may not have as adequate a background as might be necessary to understand these studies. So let's take it from there. All right, and hope that's acceptable. So this is a basic anatomical structure of the brain. As you can see on this side, this is the brain, and you can see that if it is sliced, what you see on this side is what the slice kind of looks like. So the brain is essentially comprised of the gray matter and the white matter. So the gray matter essentially is the grayish nerve tissue you see on top. It looks dark. It's surrounding this. This is the gray matter on this side and on this side. And what you have inside here is the white matter, so named because it is pale and looks whitish in color. The gray matter essentially is composed of the entire brain is composed of neurons, of course. I'm sure everybody knows that. And it's literally composed of billions and billions of neurons. Apparently, there are more neurons in one human brain than there are stars in the entire Milky Way galaxy. And the connections between these neurons are what makes us, in a way, human. Our thinking, our emotions, our processing, our cognitive functioning, all of that is basically a function of these neurons, these gray matter. Now, the neuron, essentially, you can think of it as a kind of a two-part structure. It has got in itself, you can say, the cell body, which resides or makes up these billions and billions of neurons in the gray matter. And then they have long tail-like processes which are called as axons, which transmit the messages down. Not to get too complicated, so essentially the brain, to summarize, comprises predominantly of the gray matter, which is the neurons, and the white matter, which essentially transmit the signals from the neurons downwards into other parts of the body so as to execute on those functions. So the brain is like an executive that processes information, executes orders, and then the rest of the body essentially follows. Furthermore, the brain essentially is like a towel that's sort of folded over itself number of times. So this is what it looks like. It's got this kind of a crinkled appearance, and you have what are called as gyri, which is a ridge-like folding of the brain. And then you have the sulci, these dark looking areas, which are the pits between the ridges. So the gyri are these ridges, and the sulci is the fissure which kind of exists between two consecutive gyri. All of this is important to understand what happens when age advances and we start getting what is called as brain volume loss. So it should not come as a surprise to anybody that just as we deteriorate in other aspects of our physiological functions as age goes by or as age advances, so does the brain. The brain starts in a way shrinking. And that rate is referred to as brain volume loss. So this is just a graphic. This is not part of Sahaja Yoga research. This is basically a graphic that shows on the y-axis you have the percent per year. So if this is 0%, 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5% per year, and on the x-axis on this side you have the controls, and on here you have the patients with Alzheimer's dementia. Okay, and what it shows is that in controls the rate of brain volume loss is kind of clustered around 0%. All right, so most of the controls, such as normal individuals, do not lose brain volume on a year by year basis, but that changes as age advances. And what we see here is a major clustering of almost about as high as 5% to maybe as low as 2 to 3%, the average of course being 2.8% plus minus 1%. So you can see these differences between these two, right? What that tells us is that as age advances or as compared to controls, patients with Alzheimer's dementia have a higher rate of brain volume loss in percentage terms on an annual basis. So now let's move forward. So this is again a graphic that shows the differences between a normal and an abnormal brain. So this is the normal brain on the right hand side, and this is the abnormal brain. Now what is the difference? Perhaps not discernible easily on the screen, but I'll try to walk you through it. So what happens is, in an abnormal brain, remember the gyri that we said, these ridge-like foldings that you see here, compared to the normal brain, they are much thinner. And because they get thinned out, the sulci, which are the cavities or the kind of gaps between consecutive ridge-like foldings, they also start widening in a way. So the normal brain in a way looks more filled out, for want of a better expression. The abnormal brain starts looking as though it is desiccated or it's beginning to lose its matter. That's literally the case, because as age advances we start losing brain volume, as we saw in the previous slide. So once again, normal brain, which looks fuller, which seems to be there is kind of the gyri, so-called the ridge-like foldings, and the sulci, which are the cavities between the gyri, seem less thinner. However, as age advances, the abnormal brain, in a way, starts looking as though the gyri are thinning out, and therefore the sulci, or which are the gaps between those ridge-like foldings, are also widening. All in all, it suggests that compared to a normal brain, in an abnormal brain there is less matter. Okay, all right. So with that, we look furthermore once more to try to get a better understanding of what we just saw. We have sort of switched places in a way. Now on this side is what you have your normal brain, right? There are certain parts of it that are labeled. This is the cortex, the gray matter, hippocampus, which is a small area on the lower side, and you have the another cortex here, entorhinal cortex. On this side is the abnormal brain, and what we see here on the abnormal side is that compared to this side, you might see, particularly here, these are known as the ventricles of the brain, okay, this particular area. And as compared to this, you can see that these are much bigger and wider. They are called enlarged ventricles. And the reason why they are enlarged, as you can see here, there is hardly any space that you can see. But if you look at here, on this side, it looks much bigger and wider. So these show that these ventricles are severely enlarged, and that is because there is a shrinkage of the brain. If you compare this slide to this slide, you can see that this part shows that the brain is much smaller. Okay, so again, this is a difference between Alzheimer's disease affected brains, which is on this side, versus normal brain, which is on this side. Now let's continue. Now we get to how these things look on an MRI. So in an MRI, again, this is the healthy and older adult brain, whereas this is the Alzheimer's disease brain. And what you can see is, if you look at this central part of it, right, you can see this T-shaped kind of area, that this, as compared to this looks much darker and wider. And that's because the brain tissue that existed around these ventricles has disappeared. And that is why this dark area, so basically water in this kind of a scan, the cerebrospinal fluid, which essentially flows through these areas and nourishes the brain, essentially this part of the brain has widened because of loss of tissue, which was essentially present in these parts. You can also see on the sides that compared to this part of the brain, this looks more filled out. But on this side, you see more dark areas. So these dark areas are suggestive of the fact that there is brain volume loss. So all of this, in the preceding 3 or 4 slides, what have we learned? We have learned that that normal brain consists of gray matter and white matter. That gray matter is responsible for all our cognitive functioning. It makes us human. It makes Mozart compose his symphonies, Michelangelo his sculpture, and Einstein his theory of relativity. So that is what makes us humans. On the other hand, as age advances, particularly in an extreme condition such as Alzheimer's, brain volume decreases. It shrinks over time to about 3% per annum in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And this is how it appears on an MRI scan. All right, now let's move forward. Many of you, unfortunately, may be aware of your near and dear ones who may be suffering from dementia. In Western societies and increasingly in developing economies such as even in India, where I come from, dementia is becoming a very big burden on the healthcare systems. So now this data is slightly dated, but it is not completely dated. It is estimated that in 2015, it was estimated that we would have 9.9 million new cases of dementia. The cost of dementia in 2015 alone worldwide was $818 billion. Next year, in 2018, the projected cost is about $1 trillion. And in 2030, that is about 13-14 years from now, it is expected to double to $2 trillion, which is a fantastic sum even by any yardstick or any stretch of imagination. So dementia alone is going to cost the worldwide healthcare systems a huge amount of monies. All of this is kind of background to what follows next. I wanted to speak a little bit about a small prune-sized slab of tissue, so-called, on both sides of our brain. It's called the insula. It is very important to know a little bit about this organ, because in many studies that have been conducted using magnetic resonance imaging techniques or MRI techniques or fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging techniques, this part of the brain seems to be figuring very prominently in all of these studies. So what is this insula and what does it do? So the insula is situated in the middle part of the brain, and it is considered, all of these are hypotheses of course, because nobody can, and thank goodness for that one, can excise the insula in a group of individuals and then see what happens to them relative to those who have not lost that part of the brain. So the way some of these hypotheses come about are in individuals who suffer from strokes or have accidents and this part of the brain is damaged. One notices as to how such individuals are different relative to those who have not had this kind of damage. So essentially, therefore, the insula is hypothesized to deal with human emotions: love and hate, truth and deception, gratitude and resentment, empathy and contempt. So the insula is considered to be a very, very important part of, in a way, what makes us human, right? Take away empathy, take away gratitude, and unfortunately, in a way, take away deception or hatred. In a way, it is part of the human condition. So the insula is very important in terms of what it makes us humans, both on the good side and also, unfortunately, on the not so good side. So moving forward now, finally, after this relatively longish introduction, and hopefully it will be clear as to why we needed this introduction to contextualize what we are about to see. So we have two studies that were conducted in using the Sahaja Yoga meditation techniques. Both of them were conducted by researchers in Spain and out of the Institute of Psychiatry in King's College London. And let's move forward and understand as to what was done and what were the results of the study. So the first study was designed to look at the effects of long-term Sahaja Yoga meditation, and the objective was to investigate the differences in the gray matter volume. Presumably we still remember what we tried to go through about 10 minutes ago as to what is gray matter. So the idea was to investigate the difference in gray matter volume. Remember, as time advances, gray matter volume decreases. An extreme case being Alzheimer's, where a lot of gray matter is lost, and that leads to clinically a condition known as dementia. So the idea was to see if there are differences in gray matter volume relative with the practice of Sahaja Yoga meditation. Now, before we move forward, this is the right time to say very clearly that Sahaja Yoga meditation is not a cure for dementia or for Alzheimer's. When we present these studies, most of the time, the key question we get asked is, if I practice Sahaja Yoga meditation, will I never suffer from Alzheimer's? That is not the point. That has not yet been shown in clinical trials. It is entirely possible that to a degree the effects might be mitigated, but to make a direct claim that the practice of Sahaja Yoga meditation will completely obviate any risk of developing Alzheimer's or any other form of dementia would not be appropriate. I just wanted to make that very clear as a caveat. So the design of the study was, there were 23 practitioners of Sahaja Yoga Meditation, and they were compared to 23 appropriately matched controls. For those of you who may have a background in research, this means that the study was fairly robust. It was not just Sahaja Yoga meditation practitioners compared to nobody. So these were appropriately matched controls, age, gender, other socioeconomic kind of strata, and variables that are done in these kinds of studies. It's a cross-sectional study. In other words, it was done at one point in time. It's not that subjects were followed up for long periods. So the design of the study is a cross-sectional study. The controls did not practice any meditation or yoga. That's important, because when you want to compare two groups, you want to make sure that the controls are not involved in the practice of your variable of interest. In other words, if you want to compare the effects of, say, smoking on cardiovascular disease, you take a bunch of smokers and you compare them to non-smokers. If you cannot compare smokers to smokers, you have to compare smokers to non-smokers, so that you can see that if smoking is the variable of interest, it is the only difference between the two groups. So likewise, in this particular exercise, the controls did not practice meditation or yoga, but otherwise they were age and gender matched. Okay. The Sahaja Yoga practitioners were approximately, they were 14 years of, into 14 years of practice. They averaged about 84 minutes a day, which is a fairly long time. We probably do not do that kind of thing on an everyday basis, but this is self-reported. The technique was MRI, which is basically, and it's a voxel based morphometry study. So what does that mean? Essentially, if you think of a television screen, I'm sure everybody is aware that a screen is essentially made up of millions of pixels, small pixels that light up, but they light up so fast that the eye does not discern the momentariness of any single pixel. So if you think of this as voxel are like pixels but in three-dimensional space. So what the MRI does is it takes a look at the brain, it scans it, it breaks up into these hundreds of thousands of small three-dimensional cube-like structures, and then mathematically that whole picture is integrated using very sophisticated statistical software and algorithms. So that is essentially what an MRI does, and it is one of the first studies that has used this voxel-based morphometry technique to examine the effect of long-term Sahaja practice. So now we come to the results, and I'm going to try to make this as relatively easy as possible given the limitations of a laptop screen. But let's try this. So what was seen as the significant differences as compared to controls? Okay, there are three panels, panel A, panel B, and panel C, and they highlight different areas of the brain in the three different panels, but the same area, looking at the same area from three different angles. Okay, so hopefully that's pretty clear. So we have in panel A on this side, let's focus on that one. It's called the ventromedial orbitofrontal cortex. It doesn't matter, the name is not that important. What really is important is that it controls our attention. Okay, so this is the ventromedial cortex, and relative to controls, this area of the brain was lit up. You can see these little spots here. What that shows is that that particular part of the brain was actually prominently lit up as compared to controls. That part of the brain that affects, that controls our affect and attention control. Affect is our emotions. So sometimes when we do not show any emotion, or if there are people who have problems with this part of the brain, they are unable to demonstrate emotion, and we call that as blunted affect. So that's affect and attention control are part of this, and it shows that that area was significantly different relative to controls. Now we come to insula. So we also see that this part of the brain, which is the insula here. Remember what we said, insula was that part of the brain that kind of made us, it was like a wellspring of emotions. It controls those kinds of sentiments that we express. And that part of the brain was also significantly different in meditators as compared to control. So this is where the insula is. Now we move to panel B. In panel B, what we see is that in the right inferior temporal lobe, this part of the brain, or here, just two different ways of looking at the same part of the brain, here, here, and here, that was also significantly different. And that part of the brain is responsible for socio-emotional abilities. Then we have the angular gyrus, which is again a third part that was significantly different between meditators and controls. And this part of the brain controls attention and language. So to summarize on this side, what we see is that certain parts of the brain which are known to be associated with attention control, empathy and self-awareness, both visceral and emotional, that's particularly the insula, the inferior temporal, such as that controls our, that is correlated with socio-emotional abilities, and the part of the brain that looks after attention and language. All these parts were significantly different in those who practiced Sahaja Yoga meditation for a long time relative to those who practiced no form of meditation or yoga. The second part of the same study essentially continues different other parts of the brain. So another part of the brain, which is the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, doesn't matter what the name implies, but that is again controlled with corresponds to attention and emotional processing. We saw on the previous slide the right insula. Now this is the left insula. Remember, we said it's a very important part of the brain. Again, to repeat, it deals with empathy and increased self-awareness. And then the most important part of all of this study was this one, that the overall gray matter was larger. The overall gray matter volume in those who practiced Sahaja Yoga meditation was larger as compared to control. And what that implies is potentially enhanced consciousness and potential delay of normal age-related decline. This is of tremendous significance, because if meditation has been shown to increase overall larger gray matter volume, that, dear friends, is of terrific significance, because there is at the moment no pill, no procedure, nothing that modern medicine offers that can actually increase gray matter volume. Remember what we saw at the beginning of the presentation. As age advances, gray matter decreases. If through meditation practice, specifically Sahaja meditation practice, if the gray matter volume can actually increase or even be kept constant relative to an age-related decline, that's a terrific win. And that's a terrific advantage and a very significant benefit of Sahaja Yoga meditation. For those who are statistically inclined in this audience, what we see here is that between meditators and controls, this is a box and whisker plot, right? This is the box, these are the whiskers, and this is where the median is. So what we see is that on the y-axis, the gray matter volume essentially is higher than in the control. So, and there was a statistically significant difference between these two groups. So, what is the conclusion of the first study? That long-term practice of Sahaja meditation was associated with larger overall gray matter volume. To date, Sahaja Yoga meditation is the only meditation practice with this finding. The regional enlargement that was seen in areas associated with sustained attention. Remember, when we practice Sahaja, we try to focus our attention, self-control and compassion. So it's possible that what we are trying to do through Sahaja, that is increase our empathy, increase compassion, increase our feeling for our fellow human beings, is in fact potentially reflected through MRI findings, which is tremendous. So what this study or studies like this show is that meditation is no longer to be considered something in the realm of philosophy or in the realm of belief-based practices. This is now an evidence-based practice. So what we have hypothesized through the Sahaja Yoga meditation paradigm now has relative proof through MRI-based techniques. If there is one takeaway from this presentation today, I would request that this be so. All right, and then finally again a disclaimer that there is no evidence yet that shows that Sahaja Yoga meditation can impact the onset of dementia. So once again I wanted to clarify that, but the benefit of Sahaja Yoga meditation in those parts of the brain that deal with attention and self-control and compassion certainly seem to be different relative to controls. So now with that, let's go to study number 2. We are already about 33 minutes into the session, and hopefully in another 5 minutes we can wrap this part up. So the second study was also done by the same group of researchers based out of Spain and in London, and this monitored neural activity through functional MRI. Functional MRI is like watching a video of the brain as an individual is sitting. So MRI is like a photograph. Functional MRI is more like a video. So the activity that is ongoing in the brain can be monitored using magnetic resonance imaging. So the objective of the study was this particular study was superb, which was to identify the neural correlates. Are there parts of the brain that correspond to what is the state of mental silence as experienced through Sahaja Yoga meditation? Sometimes we call it thoughtless awareness. It's the same thing, just a different terminology. So the idea was to see if this state actually exists if one practices Sahaja Yoga meditation, or is just a figment of our imagination. So in this study, again, we had 19 experienced meditators who underwent fMRI or functional MRI in 3 consecutive meditation periods. It's a long protocol. We will not belabor that. Those of you who can see the slides, the study has been published, and it is easily, you can easily download it from the internet to read it. But essentially it was a protocol where individuals went through short consecutive meditation periods, and between each period you have to have a control. So in other words, somebody called James will act as his own control. Somebody called Jane will act as her own control. So you have to alternate when you do an fMRI, a functional MRI, between an active period and a control period. So you are compared to you. James is compared to James. Jane is compared to Jane, because everybody's mental activity is unique. So that's why it's called a self-controlled single cohort study. Okay, you don't have a comparator cohort. You don't need one. Why? Because you act as your own control. If I undergo fMRI, I will act as my own control. So it's a kind of a before-after thing. And these were again individuals who practiced for about 12 years of Sahaj. They've been practicing it for a fairly long time every day. And we move on. So these are the registered conditions. You had a control condition, and then they went through 3 sequential meditations. They were asked or instructed to keep the attention in the fontanelle area that is on top of the brain, top of our head, which I'm sure you do when you meditate in these sessions, and to get into a state of mental silence. And before each condition, they opened their eyes to watch a 20-second fixation cross before the control condition, and for the 3 stages, the image of the founder that we see, Shri Mataji, for about 20 seconds. Why was this done? As I said earlier, in the fMRI, you need to see what is the resting state, what is the basal state of the individual's brain. And that's why you do these exercises, so that you get a solid baseline to compare it to when you actually look at the intervention. So in this instance, the intervention is the meditation. When they look at a 20-second of a fixation cross, that is to get the baseline. And then they go into meditation, and that's when the fMRI is also done and the activity is compared. So this is one slide which summarizes everything, all the changes, and it is an aggregate of all the individuals who meditate. These are not individual MRI brains. So these are It's as though all the 12 participants' brains were combined, all the data was combined into one MRI. And what you see here is to look at this uh, longitude, not longitudinally, but horizontally, this way, this way, this way, this way, and this way. So what we see here, this is first meditation, the control meditation, versus this is the second meditation, this is the third meditation, and this is a combination of all three meditations. Okay, what we see here is that in the first state of meditation, the area of the brain that is lit up is much less than that of controls. Okay, it is med 1 greater than control, med 2 greater than control, med 3 greater than control, and this is a combination of all the three meditation states, and that is greater than control. So what we see now is that as they sequentially go through deeper and deeper states of meditation, first meditation followed by second meditation, followed by third meditation, the areas of the brain, the actual amount of brain that tissue that gets lit up actually kind of goes down, and it lights up in those areas which we previously knew were involved with meditation. So essentially, initially they pass through an intense activity of their brains being lit up, but as you can see, as you move sequentially downwards, the activity kind of goes down across the board. Okay, and this is just towards the end. It's a combination of all three meditation states, but this is 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, and if you could discern that discern this on your screens, you will see that the overall neural activity actually goes down. So what does that mean? So Sahaja Yoga meditation practice compared with the control condition of just normal breathing activity, that the meditators do appear to pass through an intense period of self-control when you are trying to consciously control your thoughts, and that activates certain parts of the brain, both on the frontal and in the temporal areas. And but following that, the practitioners gradually experiment relatively reduced brain activation focused on the right inferior frontal cortex and the insula. Remember the famous insula, that small prune-sized slab of the brain. Again, these are regions that are associated with greater subjective depth of SMS or mental silence. And the final meditative state is also associated with a subjective depth. So that essentially concludes the presentation. What we have seen through these two studies that have been done with Sahaja Yoga meditation, in the first one we saw that as compared to controls, those parts of the brain that are known to be associated with attention control, with self-awareness, with empathy, are certainly more activated than those who are not. Very important and critical distinction is that the overall gray matter volume was more in those who meditated using Sahaja Yoga meditation techniques versus the controls. So those are absolutely brilliant findings, and we are very proud of them. In the second study, which was a functional MRI study, it essentially showed that the state of mental silence, or sometimes called thoughtless awareness, is perhaps real, as evidenced by the fMRI or the functional MRI scan, which showed that the practitioners actually went into deeper and deeper states of meditation, as evidenced by reduced activity overall as compared to controls, and also a distinct activity in those regions of the brain that we know are associated with meditation states. So with that, we conclude the formal part of the presentation. I would just request that all of us now try to meditate for just about 5 to 10 minutes, because at the end of the day, these sessions that Alan has initiated are about meditation. It's been wonderful talking to all of you, and I would now request that all of us who are sitting and are live close our eyes, and we start to try to get into a state of meditation. So let's begin. First of all, let's keep our palms open in our laps, eyes closed, and take a few deep breaths and let it go. just imagine what we are doing now actually has been shown to have an impact on the brain. Isn't that amazing? So let us now put our hand on the heart, the right hand on the heart. And we say the affirmation, I want to become the spirit. Let's say that a few times. I want to become the spirit. Now let us place our hand across our forehead, right hand across our forehead. And if possible, if we can keep our attention on this energy center. And here we say the affirmation, I forgive everyone, including myself. Let's try to say that 3 times. And now let's place our hand on the crown of our head, center of our palm touching the crown. Let's try to rotate it in a clockwise fashion, as you always do. If we can keep our attention on the crown or the fontanel area, we say the final affirmation, I want to experience my self-realization. Let's try to say that 7 times. All the time moving the palm gently on the fontanel area in a clockwise fashion. I want to experience my self-realization. Let's bring our palm down. Let's bring our hand down, sorry. Place it in our lap, eyes closed. can gently open our eyes now. So once again, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Alan, for inviting me to participate. It's been a real pleasure and a real privilege to be a part of this. Please do remember that based off of these studies, this form of meditation does seem to help, as is evidenced by these data. So would be happy to answer any questions should you post them, and thank you and best wishes for meditation in the times to come. Thank you. Bye bye and have a great day.